Hi, my name is Gene Green, and I'm Professor Emeritus of New Testament from Wheaton College and Graduate School.
Dr. Gene Green. Gene, good to see you. Welcome back to Exegetically Speaking.
Well, Dr. Capes, David, it's great to be here with you.
It's good to see you. I mean, I'm always glad to be in your presence, and particularly here on Wheaton College campus.
It's a lovely day here in Wheaton with the fall colors and rain and gray skies.
Well, we're
As
used
you
to
remember
that.
it.
I remember it, yeah, but I tell you, the colors are just fantastic.
That's true, but I know what comes next.
Well, that's true. That's true. That's why we're here in October and not January.
Right. That's right.
Hey, you've been a friend of this podcast for a while. We've talked on a couple of occasions, but today we're going to talk specifically about one of the books that you love and have become an expert on is 1 Peter chapter 2. And we're going to be looking at a particular word that is subject to a lot of inquiry and discussion.
And that word is hypotasso. And I think if Peter was here, he would probably grimace at my pronunciation. It's a word that is translated variously as to submit, to be subject to, and or to accept the authority of, depending on the translation that you have. You find it in 2:13, where Peter talks about being subject to the state, and then in 2:18, where the household slaves are to be subject to their masters, and 3:1, where Peter talks about wives being subject to their husbands. Later on in chapter 5, it appears the young are to be subordinate or subject to the elders. And then in 3:22, it's used with reference to angels, authorities, and powers being subject to Christ. So it's a word that appears very, very often. But interestingly enough, it's always translated, what I'd want to say a little bit euphemistically.
Okay. All
Euphemistically. Right. Yeah, the word, now as you know, we have to be careful about using etymology to discover the meaning of words. But in this case, going back to the basic components of the word is extremely helpful. It has to do with being under, hupa, the orders, the taxis or the tage, and being under the orders. And the language, the word maps to the concept of being not subject to or accept the authority of, but rather being subordinate. Now, it comes from a world, the Roman world, where you had superordinate powers and subordinate.
Okay, explain that just a little bit for those
Superordinate would be like the emperor.
Okay.
And somebody that has power and authority in society.
He's at the top of the pyramid.
He's at the very, very top
pinnacle of the food chain. Right.
And the subordinate ones are everybody else, really. You have the emperor on top, and then you have the senators and the equestrians, and then it goes down from there. Obviously, right on the bottom of that stack are the slaves, and even below them are aliens, non-citizens. So this is a society where everyone is always asking what your position is in this vertical hierarchy.
And in a way, people knew what their position was.
They knew
right?
it, and it was even marked, where you would sit in the stadium, your seating,
right.
The type of clothing that you'd wear, you would be marked as either superordinate or subordinate. And so I think what Peter is doing, and Paul as well in Colossians and Ephesians, is trying to tell Christians how to live out their faith in the way that these way society is structured. How do I live as somebody who is subordinate, as a slave to the master? Or how do I live as somebody who is subordinate to the governmental powers, the Peter uses the word king to reference the emperor. I'm subordinate to him. And it also talks about the young being subordinate to the elders. And
I kind of like that. The older I get.
as an old guy with gray hair, I'd agree.
Yeah.
But also wives being subordinate to their husbands.
Yeah.
Now, that brings all kinds of problems with it. We know that in the antebellum South, people would take texts like 1 Peter and Ephesians and Colossians and say, well, slaves need to be subordinate to their masters. And they considered that slavery was an institution that had to be perpetuated. And we fought a civil war
and
over
in
that.
some way divinely appointed.
And divinely appointed, right. And I commend to the listeners a book by our friend Mark Noll, The Civil War is a Theological Crisis. And it was a crisis of exegesis, really. And how do we interpret Scripture? It's a hermeneutical crisis.
Right.
Because people say, well, slaves are to be subordinate to their masters, therefore we must endorse slavery. But you know what Peter and Paul are trying to do is lay out how to live as a Christian within those orders as they found them. And there's some really, really subversive things in here that the wife in 1 Peter chapter 3 can have her own God and doesn't have to submit her or subordinate herself to her husband in relationship to the God that she serves. The slaves recognize that they have a higher power, that their labors will be rewarded, that the Lord sees them. And so you have some changes in the way the orders happen. Now, here's the deal. I think we have to go beyond what this term meant then and ask a second question about whether we can change the orders. And that's a really important piece.
Yeah.
Really,
Because they say we're trying to change the Bible now.
Well, Peter
Right.
says, well, that's the way people thought, Peter says for all of us to be subordinate to the king. Well, does that mean that we shouldn't live in a representative democracy?
No, we have to move over to England.
So we change the orders. And now we ask a new question about how do we live out our faith in these new orders as we found them. We're sitting here at Wheaton College. Its first president was Jonathan Blanchard, who was an abolitionist. And Blanchard and the abolitionists changed the orders. And we know about the Emancipation Proclamation, and they changed the orders. And so it goes with the way that husband-wife relationships were structured in the Roman world. And
are we to accept that kind of ordering of society in our own lives here today?
Well, see, the question is, do we want to import to 21st century, the United States, the social structures the orders as they existed at that time? See, and I think that's what some people have thought about, especially when it comes to husband-wife relationships. Can the orders change? And I'd want to say that's what we've done as a church. Now, the problem comes in, how do we translate this term? Now, if I were the ruler of all translators, which I'm not, I would probably ask that it be translated be subordinate, because that's what it means. We have, I think, that to talk about submit or accept the authority of are really euphemistic translations of that. It's a softening of the term. So I think we should translate it, be subordinate, but then ask a second question about what Peter and Paul are trying to accomplish in these domestic codes, as they're called, the husband-wife relationships, the master-slave, the parent-child, and our relationship to the state, like in Romans 13 and 1 Peter chapter 2. What were they trying to do? And they're trying to tell Christians how to live as a Christian in the orders as they found them. And we all know that the faith is incredibly durable, and we're able to follow Christ within whatever situation we have. But I think there's a higher calling to look at how we might change those orders. And that's what happened exactly with the abolition of slavery and the changeover from living underneath a king.
A monarch from a monarch to
that's
representative
it.
government.
That's it. So it's an important term. So
these are both exegetical, but also hermeneutical questions.
Exactly.
So these two things belong together.
Right.
Otherwise, you've got one plane flying on one wing, or trying to.
Exactly.
And
Exactly.
It's not going to fly very long that way.
It's hermeneutics all the way down.
Right.
And how do we interpret these texts, both within their historical frame of reference, and then also what does this then mean for us today? So it always has to include hermeneutics, and we go on to do theology. Now, this is where Jonathan Blanchard and the abolitionists shone like the sun, because they took texts like Galatians 3:28, there's neither slave nor free in Christ Jesus. They looked at God's original plan in creation. All humans were equal. There were no slave and master relationships. And also Christ himself, who died for all. And that included the master and the slave. They sat together. They shared a common cup. They sat at the table together. And so that was beginning to change up the orders as they were found in the day, but slowly. So we could say the work of theology is never done. You know, we've got to, as your podcast has shown, do our exegesis, but make sure that we go on to think hermeneutically and theologically. Blanchard took a look at the whole arc of the Bible and said,
That's what
okay,
we need to do as well.
And we need to do that as well, and move beyond simply our proof texting, which happens way too much, as we know.
It does. Dr. Gene Green, thanks for being with us today on Exegetically Speaking.
Great to be here. Bless you all.
Thanks to Gene Green again for being with us on the podcast. When he left the podcast booth today, he said, I bet this podcast is going to get some people wondering and thinking and maybe shaking their heads. Yeah, that's very possible. This is a controversial topic, but I think he's done a good job for helping set out what some of the hermeneutical possibilities are in dealing with this important word that we find particularly in Peter and in Paul, hypotasso. Does it mean to be subordinate to be subject to be submissive to? What is the range of meaning and the right meaning for the passages that we're reading? So anyway, thank you so much, Gene. We look forward to the time that you come back. If you have questions or comments, you just want to be in touch, exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu is our email address, exegetically.speaking@wheaton.edu. If you want to study at Wheaton College, and we hope you do because it's a great place, the best place to go is our website. Go to wheaton.edu/languages. That'll take you right to modern and classical languages. wheaton.edu/languages. We look forward to hearing from you and seeing you on our campus. Until next time, I'm David Capes. Thanks for listening.